She thought it was just a routine appointment, but when she met the millionaire doctor, everything changed. What started as a simple visit quickly turned into something she never saw coming. What happened next will leave you questioning everything. You won't believe how this story ends. Mia Harper sat in the sterile waiting room of Maplewood Women's Health Clinic, clutching the clipboard with the intake form in her trembling hands. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so vulnerable. The soft ambient music that filled the air and the gentle scent of lavender from the diffuser did little to calm the nervous energy that surged in her chest. In fact, the more she tried to focus on the paper in front of her, the more disjointed her thoughts became. Her fingers gripped the pen so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She had spent weeks avoiding this moment, telling herself that it wasn't necessary, convincing herself that it would just go away. But now, the discomfort she had been feeling for weeks was impossible to ignore, and there was no other choice but to confront it. Mia had always been a practical woman. She had built her life around the idea of control. Logic, hard work, and independence were her constant companions. So finding herself here in a room filled with soft lighting and impersonal decor felt like a breach of her carefully constructed world. Everything about this appointment felt invasive, from the questions on the form, simple, innocuous ones, about her medical history and personal details, to the anxiety gnawing at her from within. It all felt so foreign to her. Her mind swirled with worries that she didn't want to face. The last time she had seen a doctor had been years ago, and even then it had been for something minor. But this was different. She wasn't sure exactly what was wrong, but she knew it was something that couldn't be ignored. She wiped her clammy palms on her jeans and tried again to focus on the form. The questions were simple. Name, date of birth, medical history. Nothing complicated, yet every word on the page seemed to blur into an indistinguishable mess. Just fill it. Out. You've dealt with worse, she muttered to herself, willing her hands to stop shaking. But no matter how many times she told herself to breathe, the tension in her chest remained tight and unyielding. She had spent weeks Googling her symptoms at night, her stomach twisting in fear as the worst possibilities flooded her mind. Late night. Searches and health forums had only deepened her anxiety, leaving her convinced that this visit was long overdue. The receptionist at the clinic had recommended Dr. Alexander Brooks, one of the city's most well-known gynecologists. Mia hadn't thought much about it at the time. To her, a doctor was just a doctor, someone who would do their job and leave her to go back to her life. But now, as she sat here, her mind raced with uncertainty. What if she was overreacting? What if the doctor would think she was being dramatic? What if he looked at her with pity, or worse, disapproval? It's just an exam, Mia, she reminded herself. Just a doctor. Nothing to be scared of. But the words did little to calm her racing heart. Finally, the nurse entered the room holding a clipboard in her hand. She smiled warmly as she addressed Mia, calling her name. Mia almost jumped at the sound of her own name being spoken aloud. She had been so lost in her thoughts that the nurse's presence startled her. Swallowing hard, Mia stood up, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. She followed the nurse down the hallway, passing closed exam rooms. The faint scent of antiseptic clung to the air, and Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something she wasn't ready for. The nurse led her into a small, quiet room and gestured to the exam table. "You can take a seat here. Dr. Brooks will be with you shortly." Mia nodded mutely, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest. The room was impeccably clean, everything in its place, from the sterile white walls to the clinical, tools neatly arranged. The dim light and soft decor were meant to calm, but all Mia could feel was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She sat down stiffly, keeping her back straight and her hands folded tightly in her lap. The quiet was oppressive. It felt like she was the only person in the world, and the seconds stretched into minutes. She looked around at the framed certificates on the wall, the sleek desk in the corner, and the ominous-looking exam chair beside it. The chair looked like something out of a horror movie, and she forced herself not to focus on it, instead counting the cracks in the walls, anything to keep her mind distracted. Then the door opened and everything inside her froze. The man who entered was not what she expected. Dr. Alexander Brooks was tall, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway. His dark hair was slightly tousled in a way that seemed effortlessly charming, and his eyes, his piercing green eyes, held a quiet intensity that made Mia's breath catch in her throat. He wasn't the older, serious man she had pictured in her head. He was impossibly handsome, exuding a sense of calm confidence that made her feel both mesmerized and uneasy. He wasn't supposed to look like this. Doctors weren't supposed to look like this. His smile was warm, friendly, and completely disarming. "Ms. Harper," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "I'm Dr. Alexander Brooks. I know this might be a bit nerve-wracking, but we'll take it at your pace." Mia couldn't answer right away. Her mouth went dry, her throat constricting. The words got caught in her throat and she cursed herself for being so flustered. "Doctor." Brooks didn't seem to mind. He gave her a reassuring smile, his gaze gentle yet direct. "It's okay, Mia," he said, his voice full of understanding. "I know this can be uncomfortable, but I promise I won't do anything you're not ready for." Mia nodded quickly, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. She was too aware of how awkward she must look, sitting there staring at him like an idiot. She had never felt this way around anyone before, disarmed, vulnerable, and unsure of herself. It was like the ground beneath her had shifted, and she wasn't sure how to find her footing. Dr. Brooks settled into the chair across from her, flipping through her file with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times before. He glanced up at her briefly, his eyes softening as he took in the way she was sitting, tense, unsure, nervous. "I see this is your first visit," he said, his voice light and reassuring. "I know it's a lot to take in, but we'll go slow. Nothing happens unless you're completely comfortable." Mia couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed, but something in his tone, something in the way he didn't rush her, put her at ease, if only just a little. She nodded, her fingers still tightly gripping the edge of the clipboard. Dr. Brooks smiled at her. "How are you feeling?" Mia squeezed her hands together, trying to steady her nerves. "Fine," she lied. "Just a little nervous." He chuckled softly, and it was a warm, genuine sound that made Mia's heart skip a beat. "I understand. A lot of people feel the same way. But I promise, I'm not that scary." Mia managed a nervous smile, but deep down, she wasn't sure how much she believed him. Dr. Brooks wasn't scary. He wasn't frightening in the least, but the way he looked at her, so patient, so understanding, was terrifying. She had never felt this exposed, this vulnerable, and part of her wanted to run, to escape the feeling that was slowly consuming her. But the other part of her, the part that longed for something real, something more, wanted to stay, to see where this would go. As he continued speaking, his voice calm and steady, Mia's thoughts seemed to quiet. Maybe it was the way he spoke, or maybe it was the warmth in his eyes, but for the first time since entering the clinic, she felt a glimmer of calm. Dr. Brooks wasn't just a doctor. He wasn't just a man in a white coat. He was someone who made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had always believed. "We'll take things at your pace, Mia," he said softly, looking at her with such understanding that Mia couldn't bring herself to look away. "And you don't have to do anything unless you're ready." And for the first time in a long time, Mia felt like she was ready. Ready to face what was coming, ready to take the next step, even if it meant facing the parts of herself that she had been hiding for so long. In that moment, as she finally took a deep breath and let go of the tension that had held her captive for so long, Mia realized that sometimes the hardest part wasn't facing the unknown. It was allowing yourself to trust, to be vulnerable, and to accept that maybe, just maybe, everything didn't have to be perfect. The days after Mia's appointment at Maplewood Women's Health Clinic seemed to blur together. But one thing was undeniable. Dr. Alexander Brooks haunted her thoughts. She couldn't shake the memory of the way he looked at her, the way he spoke with such ease and kindness, as though it was natural for him to be both a doctor and someone who could make her feel seen. She had tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just a doctor-patient interaction, nothing more, nothing less. But she knew deep down that it wasn't that simple. She hadn't expected him to make such an impact on her, nor did she anticipate that his presence would linger in her mind long after she left the clinic. He wasn't just handsome, although that was certainly undeniable. It wasn't even his professionalism, though that too was impressive. It was something deeper, something about the way he had made her feel so comfortable, despite the vulnerability of the situation. And that was what unsettled her the most. For as long as Mia could remember, she had built walls around herself. She had become so accustomed to keeping people at arm's length, fearing that if they got too close, they would see all the cracks she had spent years concealing. Vulnerability had never been her strength. She had always kept her emotions in check, focused on her work, on her independence. Love, she had convinced herself, was a luxury, something that could come later, after everything else had been figured out. But now, with the memory of Dr. Brooks fresh in her mind, Mia began to wonder if she had been fooling herself all these years. What if, in all her striving to keep control, she had denied herself the very thing she truly wanted? Her phone buzzed, dragging her from her thoughts. She stared at the screen. A message from Dr. Brooks. "Hey Mia, just checking in to see how you're doing. I know it's been a few days since your appointment. Let me know if you need anything." Mia's heart raced as she read the message. It was kind, and yet there was something more to it. She wasn't sure what she expected, but a message like this, a simple check-in, felt like a lifeline she wasn't sure she was ready to grab. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard as she debated whether or not to respond. Why was he reaching out again? Was it just a professional courtesy? Her mind spun, overanalyzing every possible motive until she realized she was only making herself more anxious. Mia typed a reply, her fingers moving more quickly than she anticipated. "I'm doing okay. Thanks for checking in. Just still processing everything." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Almost immediately, another message pinged. "No rush, Mia. Take your time. I'm here if you ever want to talk, even about anything that's not medical." That simple sentence sent a ripple of warmth through her, as if he was extending a hand through the screen, asking her to meet him halfway. She couldn't deny that she was drawn to him, but at the same time she was terrified of what that meant. She had always kept her emotions locked away, afraid of the vulnerability that came with letting someone in. But with Dr. Brooks it was different. His kindness, his patience, it made her want to open up, to break down the walls she had so carefully constructed. But there was a voice inside her, one that had been quieted over the years, telling her to be careful. Telling her that if she wasn't careful, she would end up lost in something she didn't fully understand. She had spent her whole life protecting herself, guarding against the hurt that came with opening up. Could she really allow herself to be vulnerable with someone like him? Someone who had so much control over his life, someone who seemed to have it all together. How could someone like him possibly want someone like her? The questions swirled in her mind, each one louder than the last. She tried to shake it off, to focus on the mundane tasks of her day, but it was impossible. Everywhere she went, every moment of quiet, Dr. Brooks lingered in her thoughts. His voice, his smile, the way his gaze seemed to lock with hers in a way that made her heart flutter. She couldn't escape it. Days passed and still Mia found herself avoiding his calls. She told herself it was because she was busy. She had work, a part-time job at a bookstore, her friends to see. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about being busy. She was afraid. Afraid that if she let herself fall for someone like Dr. Brooks, she would lose herself in the process. But despite her best efforts to push him from her mind, Mia found herself at the same cafe where they had first met. She hadn't meant to end up there. It was a place she went to get away from the noise of her day-to-day life. But as soon as she walked in, there he was. Dr. Brooks sitting at his usual table, a coffee cup in front of him, his laptop open, his face partially hidden behind the screen. She froze in the doorway, feeling a mix of panic and curiosity. What was he doing here? How had she ended up at the same cafe, at the same moment? As if sensing her presence, Dr. Brooks looked up. His eyes met hers, and for a moment time seemed to slow. "Mia," he said, his voice low but warm. "What are you doing here?" Mia's heart leapt into her throat, and she felt her cheeks flush. I didn't expect to see you," she stammered, her gaze dropping to the floor. He smiled. That same kind, reassuring smile that made her feel both nervous and at ease. "I could say the same thing. Do you mind if I join you?" Before Mia could answer, he had already stood up and was making his way toward her. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She had no idea what to say. Was this some sort of casual encounter? Or was he trying to make something more of it? The question swirled in her head again, faster this time. "So how have you been?" he asked, his voice relaxed, his eyes never leaving hers. Mia cleared, her throat trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I've been good, busy, work mostly." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "And thinking." "About what?" His question was gentle, but there was an underlying sincerity in his tone, as if he truly cared about the answer. Mia looked away, unsure of how much to reveal. "Just life, and what it all means. I've been a little lost lately, I guess." "Doctor." Brooks didn't say anything for a moment. He just watched her, his gaze softening. It's okay to feel lost, Mia. Sometimes it's the only way we can find ourselves. The simplicity of his words caught her off guard. She had always been so focused on having all the answers, always striving to make sense of everything. But the idea of not having it all figured out, of just being okay with not knowing, felt strangely comforting. They sat in silence for a few moments, the hum of the cafe and the clinking of cups filling the space between them. Mia felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over her, and she found herself smiling slightly. Maybe for once it was okay to not have everything figured out. Maybe it was okay to let someone else in, someone who genuinely seemed to care. So, Dr. Brooks said, breaking the silence with a soft laugh, "What are you thinking about right now?" Mia looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a new sense of openness. "I think I'm ready to stop running," she said quietly. Dr. Brooks's smile widened, and for the first time since she had walked in, Mia felt like she was standing on solid ground. She didn't have all the answers, but she wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied softly, his voice filled with warmth. "We all have our fears, Mia, but sometimes the best thing we can do is face them." In that moment, Mia realized something. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to be honest, with herself, with him, and with the feelings she had been trying to ignore for so long. And for the first time in years, Mia felt a sense of peace that she had never known before. Mia had always been someone who valued control. It was a principle she had lived by for years, building her life around structure, routine, and certainty. The world outside was unpredictable enough without her adding chaos to the mix, but the more she tried to maintain control over every aspect of her life, the more she realized how little control she actually had. The weeks following that afternoon at the cafe with Dr. Brooks left Mia in a state of confusion. The moments they shared lingered in her mind, replaying over and over like a song that wouldn't leave her head. He had reached out again, and each time she heard from him, it was clear that the line between doctor and something more was becoming increasingly blurred. But what did it all mean? She had thought she could keep everything compartmentalized, draw clear boundaries between work, relationships, and her personal life. But Dr. Brooks, in his gentle, persistent way, had made it impossible to keep those boundaries intact. The problem wasn't that she didn't like him. She had never met anyone quite like him. He was warm, intelligent, and genuinely kind in ways that made her question everything she thought she knew about what it meant to connect with another person. But that was the problem too. She had spent years keeping people at arm's length, learning to rely only on herself, and now here was a man who was offering her something she hadn't expected, a chance to break down the walls she had so carefully built. She was afraid that if she let him in, she would lose herself entirely, swallowed up by the complexities of a life that didn't belong to her. Mia's life had always felt small in a way. Her apartment was modest, her job at the bookstore was a means to an end, and her dreams of something more had always been pushed aside in favor of practicality. She had built a life that was easy to control, easy to navigate. But when she thought of Dr. Brooks, her carefully constructed world seemed less and less fulfilling. He was everything she wasn't. Wealthy, successful, with a world full of possibilities. And yet, he had made her feel like she mattered. For the first time in a long time, Mia felt as if there was something more out there for her. Something bigger than the small life she had built. The thought terrified her. If she allowed herself to want that life, to want him, it would mean upending everything she had known. The fear was paralyzing. Every time she allowed herself to entertain the idea of a relationship with him, the questions bubbled to the surface. Was this real? Or was it just something she was imagining? How could someone like Dr. Brooks, with all his wealth and success, ever really want someone like her? Someone who had always lived in the shadows, afraid to take risks, afraid to let herself be seen. He had everything. And she had... what? A job she was passionate about, but which barely paid the bills. A small apartment she was still trying to make into a home. And a past full of fears and insecurities that she had never fully dealt with. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much she was holding back. How much she was afraid of giving herself to him, of giving herself to anyone. And then one evening, as the sun set over the city, Mia found herself standing in front of his office again. She hadn't intended to come here. She had planned to keep her distance, to focus on her work, to distract herself from everything that had been running through her head. But somehow her feet had led her here, drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. The waiting room was as pristine as always, and the scent of antiseptic still lingered in the air. She felt a pang of familiarity, but this time it wasn't anxiety that tightened her chest. It was anticipation. When the nurse came to call her name, she followed her to the back office. Dr. Brooks was waiting for her, seated at his desk, his eyes lifting from a file as she walked in. The moment their gazes met, everything else seemed to disappear. It was as if the world outside had gone silent, leaving only the two of them in that quiet space. His eyes softened when he saw her, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to take in the way he looked at her, like he was genuinely happy to see her. "Hi, Mia," he said, his voice calm and warm. "How are you feeling?" She hesitated. How was she feeling? In truth, she wasn't sure. There was so much inside her she hadn't dealt with, so much she had buried under layers of fear and self-doubt. She wasn't sure she could be honest with him, not in the way he deserved. But then, as if sensing her internal struggle, Dr. Brooks stood up and walked over to her, his presence radiating a calm that made her feel strangely safe. "You don't have to answer right away," he said softly, his voice carrying an understanding that only made her feel more vulnerable. "I know this isn't easy for you." She looked up at him, her chest tightening. "I'm not sure what I'm doing here," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I've spent my life hiding from things, from people, from emotions, and now I don't know what to do with all of this." She gestured between them, feeling the weight of her words as soon as they left her mouth. Dr. Brooks didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. And for the first time, Mia realized that she wasn't alone in this. He wasn't just a doctor, a man with the power to heal or fix things. He was a man who had opened himself to her in a way that made her feel seen. He had given her space to breathe, to exist without judgment. "You don't have to know everything, Mia," he said, his voice low, almost like a whisper. "We don't have to have it all figured out. Sometimes the best thing we can do is simply be present in the moment." She swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. Her heart beat faster in her chest, a mix of fear and something else, a yearning for the connection she had been denying herself for so long. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what this could mean, scared of what happens if I let go. What if it's not real? What if I'm just imagining things, or worse? What if I'm not enough?" Dr. Brooks' gaze softened, and for the first time Mia saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He stepped closer, his hand gently touching hers, grounding her. "Mia," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "You're more than enough, and this is real. I'm not going anywhere, but I need you to know that whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone." The weight of his words hit her like a wave. She had spent so much time fighting against her own emotions, trying to keep herself safe, and yet here he was, offering her something she hadn't realized she wanted. For the first time in her life, Mia felt like she didn't have to carry the weight of everything alone. She could let go of the fear, the insecurities, and allow herself to be seen, flaws and all. Tears welled up in her eyes as she finally let herself lean into the warmth of his presence, the comfort of his touch. She had been afraid of opening up, of letting someone in, but in that moment she realized that it was worth the risk. "Thank you," she whispered, the words full of more meaning than she could express. Dr. Brooks smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made her heart swell. "You don't have to thank me. Just be with me." And for the first time in a long time, Mia felt the weight of her fears lift. She didn't have to know everything. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to be honest with herself and with him. And in that moment, Mia realized that sometimes the greatest act of courage wasn't in holding back. It was in letting go. Mia had spent most of her life avoiding emotional risks. Her world had been neatly packaged, organized by walls she had built over the years to protect herself. She had carefully curated her existence, steering clear of the chaos of intimacy and vulnerability. She had a job she loved, a modest apartment that suited her perfectly, and an ever-growing list of rules about what she could and couldn't allow in her life. She had lived this way because it was comfortable, because it was predictable. She could keep control over everything, everything except for her own heart. The more time she spent with Dr. Alexander Brooks, the more she realized that control was an illusion. He had entered her life so seamlessly, like a storm that gently rolled in, making her feel something she had long denied. It wasn't just attraction, though, that was undeniable. It was something deeper, something that both terrified and intrigued her. She had tried to resist him, tried to convince herself that she could keep things at arm's length, but every interaction with him only made her realize how far she had come from the life she had tried to hold on to. She couldn't deny it anymore. She had fallen for him. And that realization felt like both a relief and a weight, a mixture of exhilaration and fear that left her heart in constant turmoil. Mia had never let anyone in the way she was letting Dr. Brooks in. She had always kept people at arm's length, afraid that if they got too close, they would see the flaws and insecurities she had spent her entire life hiding. But now, standing in front of him, the distance she had kept from the world seemed pointless. He didn't judge her for the things she had been hiding. In fact, he seemed to see her with more clarity than anyone else ever had, and that scared her. What would happen to her once she allowed herself to truly open up? Would she be able to stay true to herself? Or would she lose everything she had spent so long protecting? The tension between them had been building for weeks now. Every time she saw him, every time their hands brushed or their eyes locked in that way that made her heart race, she felt like she was losing herself a little more. He wasn't just a man in her life. He was a challenge, a force that made her confront the walls she had built around her heart. And Mia wasn't sure if she was ready for it. She wasn't sure if she could risk it all for the chance at something real. But that evening, as she stood in the doorway of his office, she knew she couldn't keep running from it any longer. She had tried. She had told herself that she could keep things simple, that she could avoid diving into something that felt too complicated. But every time she saw him, her resolve weakened. She couldn't fight the pull she felt toward him. She couldn't ignore the way he made her feel. Alive, seen, important. She couldn't deny the way he made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of something more than what she had allowed herself to believe. Dr. Brooks was seated at his desk when Mia entered the room. He looked up, his expression softening when their eyes met. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation, just an openness that disarmed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. His presence was calm, like a breath of fresh air in a room that had felt too suffocating for far too long. For the first time in a while, Mia felt like she could breathe. "Hi, Mia," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of something deeper. "How have you been?" Mia's throat tightened. She had thought about this moment for days, about how she would respond, about how she would act. But now that she was here standing in front of him, all of her carefully constructed answers seemed meaningless. She wasn't sure how she was supposed to feel or what she was supposed to say. All she knew was that the truth was beginning to surface, and it terrified her. "I'm not sure," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." He didn't rush her, didn't press her for answers. Instead, he just nodded, as if giving her the space to find the words. He had always been patient with her, never pushing, never demanding. It was one of the things she admired most about him. He knew when to wait, when to let things unfold in their own time. "Take your time," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Mia swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. He wasn't going anywhere. But was she ready for this? Ready for the possibility of something more than she had ever imagined? She had always lived in the realm of safe, but this was anything but safe. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much of her life had been spent avoiding the very thing she now craved: connection, intimacy, vulnerability. Dr. Brooks was offering her all of that, but was she willing to accept it? "I've been scared," Mia admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I've been scared of what happens if I let myself fall for you. Scared of losing control. I've spent my whole life building walls, keeping people out. And now I'm not sure what's happening. What if it's not real?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, the vulnerability she had tried so hard to avoid suddenly flooding her. The walls she had built for years were beginning to crumble, and it terrified her. But standing here in front of Dr. Brooks, she knew that she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't afraid of what might happen if she let him in. Dr. Brooks stood up and walked toward her, his presence strong yet gentle. He reached out, his hand brushing hers in a simple gesture that made her heart race. "It's okay to be scared, Mia," he said, his voice low and comforting. "But you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. What we have is real, whether you want to admit it or not. But you don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to be willing to let yourself feel, let yourself trust." Mia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as his words settled in her chest. She had spent so much of her life trying to keep things at a distance, trying to control everything. But Dr. Brooks was right. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to know exactly how everything would turn out. What she needed to do was let go of the fear that had kept her trapped for so long. She took a deep breath and looked up at him, finally allowing herself to be honest, truly honest, for the first time in years. "I'm scared," she whispered. "But I don't want to be scared anymore." His hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped. He smiled at her, the same warm, reassuring smile that had made her heart race from the moment they met. "You don't have to be afraid, Mia," he said softly. "You're not alone in this. I'm right here, every step of the way." In that moment, Mia knew that she didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to be willing to take a step forward, to trust that maybe, just maybe, this was the real thing. She had spent so many years trying to protect herself, trying to avoid the pain that came with opening up. But now with Dr. Brooks, she realized that maybe the greatest risk was in keeping everything locked away. Maybe the greatest risk was in never giving herself the chance to experience something deeper, something more meaningful than she had ever known. The fear didn't disappear, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel as suffocating. Mia took a step forward, her heart pounding, but with a sense of clarity she had never known before. This wasn't about control. It was about trust, about vulnerability, and about letting herself be loved. Dr. Brooks wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and for the first time Mia didn't resist. She let herself melt into him, knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. The future was uncertain, but for the first time she wasn't afraid to take that next step. The days following the pivotal conversation between Mia and Dr. Brooks felt like a quiet storm in her life, one that for the first time seemed to be bringing more than just chaos. There was an odd sense of peace that had settled in her chest, a peace that didn't come from answers or certainty, but from the acknowledgement of something new, something real. She had taken a step towards something she had been avoiding for years, letting someone into her world, someone who didn't just offer kindness and care, but a deep, unwavering presence. Dr. Brooks was no longer just a man she saw professionally, no longer the figure in a white coat who had patiently guided her through a vulnerable experience. He had become a part of her life, someone whose actions and words had slowly peeled away the walls she had built around herself. Mia was acutely aware that everything she had known up until this moment was about to change. It had already changed in subtle ways, ways she hadn't expected, but welcome nonetheless. She no longer felt as trapped by the boundaries she had set for herself. It was strange, almost frightening, but the fear wasn't overwhelming anymore. For the first time, the fear had become something manageable, something she could acknowledge without it controlling her actions. What scared her now wasn't the idea of being vulnerable, but the thought of retreating back into herself, hiding once again behind the walls she had spent so long building. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the quiet of her apartment. Dr. Brooks had sent a message, a simple note, but for some reason it felt like a tether to the moment she had just left behind, to the moment they had shared in his office. She hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone. "Hey Mia, I was thinking about what you said earlier, and I just want to remind you, you're not in this alone. Whenever you're ready, we can take it one step at a time, together." She read the message over again. It wasn't just words. It was a promise that Dr. Brooks had shown her, not just through his words, but through his actions. Every time she had felt uncertain, he had been there, offering patience and understanding. He had made her feel like she wasn't a burden, like her insecurities were something he could meet with care, not judgment. The weight of his sincerity hung in the air, pressing against her chest in a way that reminded her of just how much she had been keeping from herself. Mia set the phone down, but the message lingered in her mind. It wasn't just a message that made her heart flutter. It was everything he represented, everything that had been slowly unraveling within her since their first meeting. He wasn't asking her to change, to be someone she wasn't. He was offering her the chance to be exactly who she was, with all her fears and flaws, and still be worthy of love and care. But even with this clarity, Mia was still hesitant. The walls hadn't disappeared completely. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She had spent so long hiding behind the facade of self-sufficiency, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone else, that her independence was all she needed. And yet, with every interaction with Dr. Brooks, that certainty had started to crumble. For the first time, she realized that needing someone wasn't a weakness. It was simply part of being human. But it wasn't just about needing someone. It was about learning to trust, to let someone be a part of her life in a way that was deeper than the surface-level connections she had maintained in the past. The next day, Mia found herself standing outside his office again. She had gone back and forth all morning, her mind filled with doubt, trying to convince herself that she should wait, that she should give it more time. But when she arrived at the door, she found herself walking in without thinking. It wasn't the act of seeking him out that surprised her. It was the fact that for the first time, she felt ready. Ready to confront whatever came next. Ready to face whatever emotions would surface in the quiet space they would share. When Dr. Brooks opened the door, his expression softened instantly as he saw her. His warmth was undeniable, like a safety's, net she hadn't known she needed. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter, and Mia did so without hesitation, feeling that familiar sense of comfort in his presence. "Hi, Mia," he said softly, his voice steady, but filled with something more. "I'm glad you came," she smiled, her breath steadying as she looked up at him. "I've been thinking about everything," she replied, her voice a little shaky but resolute. "And I think I'm ready. I'm ready to stop being afraid of what comes next." He nodded, his gaze softening with understanding. There was no rush in his movements, no pressure to speed things up. He simply stood there waiting for her to take the lead. "We don't have to figure it all out today," he said, his voice gentle. "But I'm here, Mia. Whenever you're ready." She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She hadn't expected to feel so vulnerable. But in this moment, she knew that vulnerability wasn't something to be feared. It was something that could bring them closer. Something that could lead to a connection she hadn't known was possible. "I'm ready," she said again, more firmly this time. "I'm ready to let go of all the things I've been holding onto. I'm ready to trust. Trust you, trust myself, trust what this could be." Dr. Brooks smiled, his eyes full of warmth. "You don't have to carry all of it alone, Mia. You've been doing that for so long. It's okay to share it. It's okay to let someone else be there with you." Mia felt the tears that had been building behind her eyes threatening to spill over. She had spent so much time denying herself the connection she longed for, so much time hiding from the possibility of something real. But now, with Dr. Brooks standing before her, she realized that her fears had always been rooted in a false belief that she wasn't worthy. She had always thought that love or intimacy was something that was given to people who had their lives together, people who had it all figured out. But Dr. Brooks had shown her something different. He had shown her that love wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, being vulnerable, and allowing yourself to be seen even in your most imperfect moments. "I think I've spent so much time telling myself that I can't be what I want to be," Mia said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to live that way anymore." "You don't have to," Dr. Brooks said, his voice firm yet gentle. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be real." Mia felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she let his words sink in. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid to be herself. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to hide behind the walls she had built. She could let herself be loved, and more importantly, she could love in return. The next few months passed in a blur of newfound openness and shared experiences. Mia found herself taking risks she had never taken before, letting herself be vulnerable. With him, letting him in, letting him see the parts of her she had always kept hidden. And with each step, with each moment of honesty, she felt herself growing. She wasn't perfect, and neither was he. But together they built something that was real, something that wasn't defined by their pasts or their fears, but by their willingness to trust each other. One evening, after dinner, as they sat on the couch together, Dr. Brooks turned to her with a serious look on his face. "Mia, I don't want to go another day without asking you this," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Will you spend the rest of your life with me?" Mia's heart stopped for a beat as she looked at him, the love and certainty in his eyes overwhelming her. She had never imagined this moment would come. She had never imagined she could feel this way so deeply, so fully. And yet here she was, staring at the man who had shown her that love didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. "Yes," she whispered, the word escaping her lips as easily as a breath. "Yes, I will." And in that moment, Mia realized that the greatest leap of faith she had taken wasn't in saying yes to him. It was in saying yes to herself. Mia's journey, is a powerful reminder that vulnerability is not a weakness but a strength. In her story, we see how the walls we build around ourselves, meant to protect us from pain, often keep us from experiencing the full beauty of connection and love. Through her journey with Dr. Brooks, Mia learns that it's okay to let go of control, to embrace the unknown, and to trust both ourselves and the people who are willing to stand by us. The message here is clear. True love and growth come when we open ourselves up, when we allow ourselves to be seen for who we truly are, flaws and all. This story teaches us that no matter how scared we are of what might happen, the greatest risk is not taking that leap, whether in love, relationships, or in life itself. The moment we embrace vulnerability, we give ourselves the chance to truly live, to grow, and to love. If you found this story inspiring and resonated with Mia's transformation, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support fuels us to keep creating more heartfelt stories that inspire and touch lives. Stay tuned for more stories and keep believing in love, second chances, and the power of vulnerability.